All the evidence that Darwin had is actually evidence for creation.
So are you saying that natural selection is actually a biblical argument?
Yes, natural selection is a biblical argument.
If God is an engineer, we'd expect him to create things to be adapted and changed.
And if he hadn't, most species would already be extinct. God, as the ultimate engineer, created his organisms to withstand and to adapt. All the evidence of evolution right there is actually creationism. So Darwin's brainchild was a complete bust.
So if we could bring it all together and you could concisely sum up how a Christian should think about natural selection, what would it be? For over 150 years, people have associated the idea of natural selection with evolution. Yet the idea was in circulation long before Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, and it's generally accepted by creationists today. Dr. Robert Carter, I know you have a PhD in coral reef ecology and genetics, and you've studied these topics for many years. And I know from some of the conversations that we've had before we started recording that you say that natural selection and evolution are not the same thing at all, and in fact might actually be opposites. So what separates natural selection from evolution?
One is a cause and one is an effect.
Okay.
The idea of natural selection leading toward long-term grand-scale evolution, that's what Darwin posited in his book, The Origin of Species. He suggested that if you have a little bit of change now, over enough time, with enough change in the right direction, you might be able to explain the common ancestry of all things. But one's a cause and one's effect. So the cause is natural selection, the effect is evolution. But he put his cart before his horse because the creationists at that time and today have accepted natural selection. Of course, things change. Of course, things that are better fit to the environment might have more offspring than others. Therefore, there'll be genetic changes over time. Adaptations, like just part of creationism. It's nothing new. He didn't invent anything new in The Origin of Species. He just put two dissimilar ideas together.
Okay. And so Darwin said that there was no limit to the amount of change, though, that he would see happen by natural selection.
And that's almost a direct quote from The Origin of Species.
Okay.
He said, I see no limit to the amount of change. Yes.
Okay. But he had living organisms to work with.
Exactly. He's starting with things that God created. And if God had put into his creation the ability to adapt and change over time, then all the evidence that Darwin had is actually evidence for creation.
Okay. So are you saying that natural selection is actually a biblical argument?
Yes, natural selection is a biblical argument because it's a common sense argument. There are things that have traits that work really well in some environments and not so well in other environments. And the things that, with the traits that work really well, they tend to flourish in those environments. So over time, they'll have more offspring than the things that don't flourish, and you're going to get change over time. I mean, it's like a no-brainer.
Yeah.
The question is, how much change can you get? How far can a species go before, natural selection doesn't work anymore? Can you actually get, wings evolving from arms or photosynthesis evolving from nothing? Those sorts of things natural selection cannot handle. Evolution is actually, for the last 100 years, coming up with other ideas to add to it because the idea of natural selection itself doesn't work.
Right. Well, and that's why, we have all sorts of different mechanisms explaining the origin of life. And that's not really what we're going to talk about today. No. But the thing is, it does relate because people say, well, the first organisms were photosynthetic algae or something.
Which is, that's actually the funniest thing, that the earliest organisms we see in the evolutionary fossil record are photosynthetic organisms. Photosynthesis is the most improbable chemical reaction you could ever imagine. And it requires thousands of molecules that are light sensitive, that light would destroy, and yet it's like a butterfly trying to capture a cannonball. That's what those chemicals are, trying to capture photons. And instead of being destroyed, they hand it off to the next chemical, then the next, then the next, then the next, then the next. So each one of them takes a little bit of the energy out of the sunlight, and the plant harvests it or the algae harvests it, and they make energy. But that is incredibly complicated. Natural selection cannot explain something like that. It can explain a winnowing of defective organisms. It can explain the fine-tuning of an organism to a specific niche. But if an organism is being fine-tuned to a niche, it's by definition, that species is losing genetic diversity. Therefore, they're losing adaptive potential. Therefore, after they change, they might not be able to change anymore. So in the creation model, most of us believe that things could change faster in the past than they do now.
Okay.
Because after, let's say, after Noah's flood, right? The animals come off of the ark, they start spreading out on the earth. Well, bears are going to divide up into little sub-bear populations. And each little population is only going to have some of the genetics of the original population. And then natural selection is going to start removing some of that diversity. They're going to get fine-tuned, pigeonholed into a certain way of operating, like polar bears on ice, black bears in a forest. Polar bears wouldn't do well in the forest. Black bears wouldn't do well on ice. They've adapted to these local environments, but they can't go back. And so you have lots of change in the beginning and everything slows down. So what was Darwin looking at? Species thousands of years after creation, after all the speciation happened, after all the biggest change happened. Now he's looking at these little things and saying, okay, hey, I see no limit to the amount of change given enough time.
Yeah.
But the biblical picture already explained all the things he was seeing.
Before we continue, a quick heads up. Stick around until the end of the interview because we'll be offering an exclusive free stream of the fascinating documentary, Darwin, The Voyage That Shook the World. You don't want to miss it.
Okay, so to kind of sum up, what you're saying is that even granting the evolutionary model for the sake of argument, evolution, you have different mechanisms by which change is introduced to the population, but natural selection is the opposite because it removes some of the diversity from that gene pool.
Yes, which is why in the early 1900s, they came up with what was called the neo-Darwinian synthesis.
Okay.
They kept natural selection and then they added mutation. Because they knew natural selection was just going to reduce diversity over time. You needed a way to increase diversity so you can have more change. Oh, but if you add mutation to that, now mutations plus natural selection, that's basically what Darwinism is today.
Yeah, that's what I always grew up being taught in school or on TV programs about dinosaurs or something like that. So that's interesting. But you were saying that species in the past changed faster and that they were even designed to change.
Yes.
So tell us about some of the mechanisms.
There are so many different possible ways that God could have engineered into the original creation the ability to adapt and change over time. It's hard to even list them all. I wrote a 3-part article series on creation.com attempting to list them, and I've thought of even more since then. But you've got, initially, God creates organisms. He doesn't create 2 of each kind of organism. He created 2 humans. But how many E. coli did he create?
Okay.
Billions. How many oak trees did he create?
Yeah.
Probably millions. How many, squirrels did he create? Probably squirrels all over the world. And so all these different organisms, he could have created many or few. He could have imbued them with a rich amount of genetic diversity or a little bit. So we have all these possibilities. And then over time, as those organisms are reproducing, well, like he could have put like in a dog population, the dog-like original kind, maybe it looks more like a wolf, some genes for like small, skinny dogs, even though all the dogs were big and muscular. Well, those genes might be floating around the population for thousands of years before they finally come into one organism who has 2 copies of the small, skinny, and all of a sudden a chihuahua pops out. Where'd that come from? Well, God engineered it originally. The information was in that dog kind initially. It just was rare and it took a long time for it to finally appear. And all of a sudden you have a radical change.
Okay. So we have created genetic diversity.
Created genetic diversity as part of our model.
Then through recombination, you actually get very radically different organisms.
The potential for radically different organisms.
Okay.
But then you have sexual reproduction. During reproduction of complex organisms, our chromosomes recombine. And if you have like gene for like tall and muscular, and the opposites are short and skinny, and they're right next to each other in the genome, they might be linked together for a long, long, long time. And all of a sudden a recombination event happens. And now you can have a tall, skinny, or short, muscular. All of a sudden you have Irish wolfhounds and bulldogs.
Okay.
They appear out of nowhere. But that information was in the original creation. It just took a long time for it to be recombined to appear all of a sudden. So we can have lots of changes appearing long after creation just because of what God put into those initial genomes.
And talking about that article series, and I'll be honest, it's pretty over my head. I've heard you say that populations lose heterozygosity. I don't know what that means, but you feel it's a really strong argument for what we're talking about here today.
Yeah, really strong argument. Hetero means different. And in genetics, when you have a heterozygous site, it just means that there's two different letters on the two copies of the chromosomes an organism has. So maybe you got on chromosome 1 at position 1 million, there's an A in the chromosome you got from your father, but there's a G in the chromosome you got from your mother.
Okay.
So A and G, that would be a heterozygous site. There's two different letter combinations. And in the human genome, you carry about 3 million places where the copy you got from your father is different than the copy you got from your mother. You have about 3 million heterozygous sites in your genome.
Okay.
Populations, as they start spreading out and subdividing into isolated subpopulations, they lose heterozygosity. Like if everyone in the world died except the people on Iceland, and the Icelanders went and reconquered the world, well, they're not going to look Chinese. They're not going to look African. They're not going to look, you know, you can have a lot of light-skinned, blue-eyed, red-haired people because of the founding population. They don't have as much diversity as everyone in the world. So as bears are spreading out from Noah's Ark, as they get subdivided, isolated into a valley or on the other side of a mountain range or on the other side of a desert, they're not interacting anymore. Mm-hmm. If they've spread out, they don't have as much diversity as the original. They lose heterozygosity. That's one thing that defines species.
Okay.
A species breeds true to type. That's one of the definitions of the word species. So starlings produce starlings, cardinals produce cardinals, blue jays produce blue jays. They breed true to type. But a lot of those species can hybridize.
Yeah.
What happened was as they spread out and got isolated, they lost genetic diversity. Now all the cardinals look red. Mm-hmm. All the blue jays look blue. And you have speciation because of a loss of diversity.
Got it.
They breed true to type.
And so the only way to actually get, you know, potentially a new species or subspecies or something like that would be to have hybridization where you have genes from the outside gene pool coming into this other gene pool, right?
Yes. And one of the things the evolutionists have been very slow to recognize, and even though the information has been there for a long time, very slow to realize that hybridization often produces new species.
That's interesting.
We've seen that in the Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. We've seen that in butterflies. Lots of examples now where two species look like different species, but then it can hybridize, and all of a sudden you have new genetic combinations and new things can appear out of that.
Got it. Well, and this is a thing even in like the tropical fish hobbyists in our audience will know this. The reptile keepers in the audience will know this. How many different combinations you can get, and people often get annoyed by this because they don't want to hybridize species. They want the wild type of this fish that's found in Lake Tanganyika. Why are you hybridizing my cichlids? I want this one. Or with snakes, people want a Guyana locality of a boa constrictor.
Yeah, they don't want the king snake and the corn snake mixed together.
Yeah.
But it's not even just species we can hybridize. It's species in different genera we can hybridize.
Yeah.
So we're pushing here the limits of what are called the created kinds. So God created cichlids. He didn't create that little grayish fish that lives in Lake Tanganyika that nips the scales off the other fish.
Yeah.
He created an initial cichlid kind with diversity that rapidly speciated. It's funny because even the evolutionists say that the rift cichlids, they rapidly speciated.
Interesting.
Lake Victoria was dry ground in historic times.
Wow.
I mean, early historic times, but it wasn't millions of years ago. It was they in their model, a few thousand years ago, there was no Lake Victoria.
And now we have all these species.
500 or 600 species of cichlids in that lake now.
And they're unique to that lake, basically.
Yes. So speciation happens because of isolation, sexual reproduction, loss of diversity, hybridization. those are all parts of the creation model.
Yeah. Well, and maybe we need to take a step back too, because people will sometimes go after the idea of a created kind. But what a lot of us know, if we've kept some of these animals, we realize that species and genre are changing all the time. Like they're reclassifying a lot of these animals because it's a system by which we can classify them, but they're not bound to that.
The first scientific paper I ever published was on the morphological differences between the 3 species of corals in the Caribbean. And I spent days staring at a microscope, taking pictures of coral polyps and then measuring them digitally and then doing all the statistical analyses. My co-author did most of the statistics.
Yeah.
But we concluded that these are 3 different species. Those species have now been put into a different genera.
Great.
Yeah. So taxonomists have wrestled with this issue a long time. Evolutionists have wrestled with this a long time.
Yeah.
But when we just have this basic idea that God created groups of organisms that are designed to reproduce with each other and not to reproduce with others.
Yeah.
That's the created kind. And from that created kind, you have a massive amount of potential change. Natural selection is part of that, but it's only part of that. But selection can't do what they need. That in itself, all it can do is remove diversity. It cannot produce diversity. It cannot create complex structures and complex organs. It's a winnowing effect that should slow evolution. It should slow potential change down. So even the evolutionists are like, we can't just have natural selection. We need something else.
Yeah.
But Darwin knew that too. In his later books, he downplayed the role of natural selection in evolution.
Okay.
He even said, I think I put too much weight on this. And he introduced terms that we now call sexual selection, group selection, kin selection. These are things that are hard to define that people have been arguing about for a long time. And are they real? Are they not? What's the effect? Or should we just forget all that and just talk about natural selection itself? But because it didn't have the power, Darwin knew it and he started shifting the goalposts.
Got it.
In fact, Darwin promised many times that he was going to follow up The Origin of Species with a book about natural selection to prove his thesis. He never published that book. He said that The Origin of Species was just an abstract, and the proof, the evidence is going to come up later. We found that book. It was in his study after he died. He had about 3/4 written. He said he was going to take these 10 different organisms and show natural selection, and he couldn't do it. He failed. Because natural selection is not the engine of evolution.
Yeah.
Even though that's what we're taught in high school.
It's almost more like the quality control, but it's not the engine, right? Is that almost what you're saying?
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. It's quality control. It's specifically because it's really good. And we're personifying natural selection.
Sure, because you kind of have to.
Because it just makes language so much easier.
Yeah.
No one believes natural selection is alive. I mean, but it winnows and gets rid of the worst.
Yeah.
If you're born with 2 hearts, you're going to die. So all the defects tend to be winnowed away, and natural selection tends to keep species alive. In fact, that was more close to the pre-Darwinist ideas of natural selection.
Got it.
It was a way to maintain species robustness by getting rid of the unfit.
Got it. Well, going back to some of the engines of change.
Okay.
I've heard you talk about retrotransposons,
Oh, yeah.
and again, we're now in over my head, and I don't know what that means.
There are pieces of DNA in our genomes, many of them, that can, this end and this end, if they touch, it can make a circle, and that piece of DNA can pop out,
Okay.
joining these other things together. A lot of those retrotransposons have gene promoters in them. So if they're not there, the gene can't be turned on. If they are there, the gene can be turned on. And retrotransposons can jump around in a genome and change things. Like, have you ever seen, I don't know what it's called. I'm sure it's not politically correct to say Indian corn.
Yes,
But
I have.
the
Yes.
Native American corns that have all the different corn kernels. Well, the colors are caused by retrotransposons jumping around
Interesting.
and changing the genome of that corn kernel.
Oh, so we can actually, you're basically having a visual map on the corn kernels of where the genes
where
are
it
getting
is.
recombined.
In our brains, as a baby's developing in the womb, the retrotransposons there's a whole classification of different types of transposons. I'm just going to use that as generic. Retrotransposons cover everything, just makes it easy. But they're jumping around in our brain cells, changing the genetics of brain cells, which changes the type of brain cell that thing will become.
Okay.
So our genomes are being scrambled by retrotransposons, even when we were alive.
Okay.
If one of those things during reproduction, let's say that there's a mutation and it can't move anymore, it's that gene's now stuck in the on position. Or let's say the insertion point has a mutation where it doesn't match and the retrotransposon can't insert anymore, the gene might be stuck in the off position.
Okay, so it's almost like a degradation?
Yes, it's a fixation. It's like if that is affecting the color of a coat of a cat, or if it's affecting the ability of a dog to digest starches or not, it can have a downstream effect later on in generations because now that gene is on or off permanently.
Got it.
And so you can have change affected by these things that are designed by God to jump around.
That's pretty interesting to think about.
It's really complicated, but really fun.
Yeah.
When you talk about the creative genius of God and this engineer and what he engineered, he engineered life to adapt and change on purpose. And yet the evolutionist looks at this ability to adapt and change and say, aha, I see no limit to the amount of change. Well, wait a minute. And every engineer knows that once you make something, you can twiddle with it.
Mm-hmm.
But twiddling doesn't produce that thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I worked in a tape measure factory for several years. My dad was a plant foreman. I made tape measures. And it took a lot of machines and a lot of work and a lot of ingenuity and multiple patents to get a tape measure manufactured. But once you had that tape measure, you know what? I think I want it a little wider. I think I want to add a new mark on there so now I can mark the position between the vertical studs in a wall. Or I want the little end to wiggle so that if I go this way or this way, I can still get an accurate measurement.
Got it.
You can twiddle with it once it's made. But someone had to say, I'm going to make a tape measure. I'm going to make it out of metal. I'm going to put a spring in there and I'm going to have a hook on the end. That didn't evolve in a stepwise process.
So basically, if God is an engineer, we'd expect him to create things to be adapted and changed.
And if he hadn't, most species would already be extinct. Because the environment is variable.
Yeah.
An environment today in a sin-cursed world where there's death and there's cancer and there's all horrible things that can happen. Well, there wasn't like that initially. So he had to create species that could flourish in a good environment with no death and no suffering, and in a post-fall world where there is death and suffering. And most species were able to do that. Now, a lot of things have gone extinct, but most, especially the created kinds, have not.
Right. We have representatives of them, even if individual species like giant sloths, which are my favorite. But we still have little sloths today, or we don't have woolly mammoths, but we have elephants.
Yes.
So got it.
So that engineering aspect is critical to consider. God, as the ultimate engineer, created his organisms to withstand and to adapt. That is all the evidence of evolution right there is actually creationism.
Hope you're enjoying the interview so far. We'll jump back in shortly, but real quick, imagine bringing this life-changing message to your church or community. This is exactly what we do. We host almost 1,000 events each year, and our experienced and accredited speakers come to you without charging a set speaking fee. They deliver engaging, illustrated, and impactful presentations covering a range of topics dealing with the creation and evolution debate. We've received thousands of testimonies from people who have had their lives changed through CMI's speaking ministry. If you'd like that for your congregation or community, then use the link in the description and contact us today. Thanks again for watching. Now back to the interview. So it sounds like you're saying that God created natural selection for a world that was destroyed by sin, cursed, and very, very dangerous. So there wasn't natural selection before the fall?
Oh no, there would have definitely been natural selection before sin and death entered the world.
Okay.
Because you still got bacteria, fungi, you still got these little critters. They're not part of the things that God said are never going to die. It's the nephesh creatures, the soulish, the breathing. It's really vertebrate animals is closest to what we would define as nephesh in
And
Hebrew.
that's the Hebrew word for
soul.
okay.
Maybe insects are included in that. We can debate on where to draw the line, but bacteria,
And the objection here is that, well, natural selection requires death, and there was no death before the fall. Therefore, there couldn't have been natural selection before the fall. Is that? But you're
yes, but that definition of natural selection is not what natural selection is.
okay.
It's not about death. It's about reproduction. It's the organism that has the most number of offspring wins. That's what natural selection is.
And that's like how we define fitness in the survival of the
Yes,
fittest.
exactly. So imagine that Adam and Eve are on this planet and they're living for 1,000,000 years and they're having children and the children are spreading out. Well, they're going to build houses. They're going to cut down a tree. They're going to make a campfire. They're going to make a field for their bean patch. They're going to change the environment just by being alive. And all of a sudden, what was once a forest is now a house. And so different organisms are going to want to live there.
Yeah.
The environment has changed. The organisms that are in the soil are going to be like, wait a minute, what happened to my tree? What happened to the fungi that used to be associated with these roots? Now I have corn, and this is different. So the environment changes, the organisms are reproducing, and all you need is reproduction and a variable environment, and you get natural selection.
Okay.
So imagine the example I like to use. Imagine that there's this mountain and there's oak trees on this mountain. And in these oak trees are genes that help them tolerate wet soils and dry soils.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have one or the other. And let's say on top of the hill, it's really dry. But at the bottom of the hill, there's a river and there's some swamps. And so on this giant mountain, there's all these oak trees that maybe every 100 years they get knocked down by lightning or an elephant comes and eats them or something. Plants don't live forever. And every 100 years on average, that oak tree has to be replaced with an acorn that's in the ground.
Okay.
Which trees are going to produce more acorns on the top of the mountain?
That would be the ones
That
with
like dry roots.
Yeah.
Now, the ones who like damp roots, they still might be living, but they might not grow as fast. They might not produce as many acorns. Okay, what about at the bottom of the mountain where it's all swampy? Which trees will produce more acorns?
that would be the ones that like the wet soil, right?
Yeah. And so when a tree gets knocked over or gets eaten by an elephant, which acorns are going to be more likely to sprout in that location?
Those very same ones.
The very
right?
same ones. So
Okay.
over time, you should get a partitioning of that population. You might even get speciation, where you have the trees in the bottom might start growing buttress roots, because a lot of trees in swampy areas do that. And if you go and look at the genetics of that population over time, over 1,000 years, we'll say, you're going to see that the trees at the bottom all have the genes for tolerating swampy, wet soils. But the trees at the top of the mountain are all going to have the genes for tolerating dry soils.
Got it.
That's before the fall. That's before death.
Yeah.
Because trees aren't alive in the biblical sense. They get eaten, and therefore natural selection applies. Imagine there's a river flowing down this mountain, and this river is causing a little bit of erosion, because this is what water does. It slowly dissolves rocks. It transports sediments downstream. Well, there might be a pond near the bottom that over 1,000,000 years silts up and dries out.
Okay.
What happened to the frogs in that pond?
I don't know.
They have to hop somewhere else.
yeah.
So the environment is changing. It might be like there's some frogs that like deep water, and now 1,000,000 years later, the pond's only a foot deep. So the frogs, they might swim downstream. Who's left? The frogs that like shallow water.
Okay.
And the organisms living in the mud under the lake are going to change as the lake dries out. So you still get environmental change. You cannot stop environmental change. And environmental change plus reproduction, that's what causes natural selection. It's part of the creationist model and always has been.
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't require death at all. It just requires, like you said, environmental change, populations moving and thriving in certain areas that they might prefer to other areas.
Yeah.
And that's it. And that would account for speciation by itself.
Yeah. So natural selection is not proof of evolution, doesn't really support evolution, and is part of the creationist model.
Okay.
So natural selection is not evolution.
Yeah. Well, and I've heard you say that both evolutionary biologists and creationists can point to natural selection and say, well, see, our model accounts for this, but that means it's not really supporting either or something like that?
It's not an argument that can be used to prove either side. It's a non-discriminating argument. So it doesn't say anything. Both sides are saying, yep, natural selection is true. So now we have to look elsewhere, which is why we like to talk about the origin of life, which the evolutionist doesn't want to talk about generally.
Oh, yeah.
Because the chemistry is not there, the probability is not there, even the time is not there. They can't explain where complex life came from. And even the simplest possible life is very complex.
Yeah.
They actually believe in bigger miracles than we do.
Yeah, like photosynthesis.
Appearing
by itself.
Boom. So we have a sufficient cause for all of this. It's God, the creator, who, as an engineer, he took his wisdom and put it into living things. And now we have living things, and they change and adapt over time because of engineering genius.
Mm-hmm.
And the evolutionist wants to claim this evidence of evolution.
And they want to say that it's just mutations that are driving that, right?
Yes, but mutations don't generally improve things.
Yeah.
They can change things. You can get white coat killer and a polar bear. Okay, fine. You have a broken melanin gene, now you have a white bear. Great.
But now that's a broken gene. That's
But
not a gene that you can switch on or off or change or something.
Exactly. But natural selection can operate on such things. That's a very adaptive trait for a bear. A white coat color when you're hunting on ice is a great camouflage.
Yeah.
But that would be an awful camouflage in a forest.
So switching gears a little bit, I have heard you talk about epigenetics.
Oh, yeah.
What is it and why is it important to this conversation we're having right now?
Epigenetics is a fascinating and fairly new field in genetics. We're not talking about DNA. We're talking about the things that grab onto DNA to turn genes on and turn genes off.
Okay.
It's a series of switches that upregulates and downregulates genes and causes behavioral changes and appearance changes. Like plants flower at a certain time of year. Well, the flowering genes aren't turned on at other times of year.
Okay.
They're turned on at a certain time, and all of a sudden you get flowers. Well, these are regulators that are grabbing onto DNA or changing the shape of DNA, turning things on, turning things off, and affecting genetic expression.
So it's like something in the environment triggers the organism to adjust which genes are being expressed at a given time. Is that what it is?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a system God designed to produce change in organisms. But imagine now that natural selection comes on the scene and it's, scanning, if I could personify it again, but it's scanning all these organisms saying, that one's a better fit for the environment, but it's genetically identical to this other one.
Mm-hmm.
It's just this switches on and that switches off for some reason. And so natural selection might enable this organism to have more offspring, and yet his identical twin is not having as many offspring.
So the genomes of the two organisms are remaining stable, but
Yeah.
we see great variation maybe in them just depending on the environment that they're in.
Yes. And
Okay.
what happens is natural selection loses its target. It needs a really clear signal, a strong signal, a profound difference, so that one organism has a significantly higher or significantly lower number of offspring.
Yeah.
If an organism is going to have like 100 offspring, and natural selection says, okay, you have 99, you have 101. That's nothing. That doesn't overwhelm genetics. You have to have like a big difference for natural selection to really work. And epigenetics muddies the waters.
Okay.
It makes it harder for natural selection to operate. And yet it's one of the most profound. It's like God designed systems to create change
Yeah.
that are not genetic systems.
Okay.
And so natural selection it becomes worthless in these cases. It doesn't do anything that Darwin required, because the variability he saw, a lot of it wasn't genetic variability.
Yeah.
It was like if you and I went to the gym every day and we started working out and got all buff, right? And all the girls loved us and we had lots of kids because of that. That's not a genetic change.
Yeah.
And our kids are not going to be genetically different.
Mm-hmm.
And so if natural selection is affecting something like that, it gets blind
Yeah.
to the genetics of it. But the funny thing is that Darwin, he had this odd concept. He called it pangenesis.
Okay.
He was not a Mendelian geneticist.
Okay, you're going to have to break down the difference
Gregor
a little bit.
Mendel was the monk who invented the laws of genetics.
Oh, he had the experiments with the peas, right?
Yes, yeah, he's breeding all these peas, and he wrote his stuff just a couple years after Darwin,
Okay.
after The Origin of Species. In fact, it looks like he wrote it as a contrary to The Origin of Species, but that's another long story.
Okay.
So
For another day.
Darwin didn't know anything about what causes traits. He didn't know anything about how traits are passed from one generation to the next. So he comes up with an idea. He calls it pangenesis. He says, well, there are going to be corpuscles in the various organs of the body that bud off little information packets that go to the gonads, and those are inherited by the next generation. So the
Okay.
environment creates the offspring.
So like the classic examples of, I don't know, a duck gets a hole in its beak, and then you would expect its children to also have holes in their beaks.
The examples he used were sailors and jewelers.
Okay.
He says sailors are almost always farsighted and jewelers are almost always nearsighted.
And so then you
It's not really true, but
Yeah.
this is what he said. And since sightedness is highly heritable, maybe, therefore, there must be a way for that the jeweler, as he's squinting at his little watches all day long, that his children are going to inherit his musculature of his eyeballs.
Okay.
That's called Lamarckian inheritance. Lamarck was prior to Darwin, and he said, well, we're going to have this thing called inheritance of acquired characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have organisms that are exercising or doing whatever, and that's going to cause the offspring to change because of it.
Okay.
That is not Mendelian. That's not neo-Darwinian. It's Lamarckian.
So Mendelian models are basically what we have today, where we look at
genetics
genes.
and
Okay.
DNA and genes and sexual recombination of chromosomes and
Yeah.
But this is very different. The problem is Darwin was kind of right for all the wrong reasons.
Okay.
But we now know. I love that phrase. You know what that means when we say we now know?
What?
It means I was wrong yesterday. So the evolutionists now know that there's a lot of inheritance of acquired characteristics. I wrote an article in our Creation magazine, just the last issue, and it deals with how we've discovered that the embryo, the human embryo in the mother, before implantation, absorbs the mother's DNA from the womb
Really?
and RNA. And that DNA and RNA from the mother affects the early stages of development and affects implantation. So that's the mother controlling the baby. We've learned recently that males, the sperm will absorb RNA from the body.
Huh.
So an environmental influence is going to change which RNAs are expressed. The sperm will absorb that, and that goes into the baby and affects the baby. So the environment of the parents is affecting the child. That's
Wow.
epigenetics.
So it almost is what Darwin was saying.
It almost is what Darwin was saying, yes. But what that means is that natural selection doesn't work
Okay.
because that child is going to be affected by the environment of the parent, not necessarily the environment of the child. So if the mother's a smoker, if the dad's a heavy drinker, or if dad had scarlet fever, or the mother was starving, those genetic changes are going to produce a change in the offspring.
Mm-hmm.
And it's even weirder that when a woman's pregnant with a female baby, after only 20 cell divisions, the ovaries are finished and the eggs are in place.
Huh.
So if grandma's a smoker, she might be affecting the baby and the eggs inside the baby. And so 40 years later, if that girl becomes a woman and has a late child at like 40 years old, that child could be affected by something grandma was doing. And so now how does natural selection act on that? That child is influenced by an environment that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And it's going to grow up and be different. Its traits are going to be different because of something that happened a long time ago.
So what it sounds like you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is basically that it's not just natural selection acting on organisms that provides the change. There are all these other factors that are happening that have nothing to do with the environment where they are.
Yes. Or the DNA that they carry. Therefore, natural selection is not evolution.
Got it. Well, we have covered a tremendous amount of territory in this conversation. We've talked about first just the basic model of natural selection. We've talked about the different means by which organisms change. We've talked about specific examples of all of that. And we've talked about epigenetics and how that works. So if we could bring it all together and you could concisely sum up how a Christian should think about natural selection, what would it be?
I would say that natural selection is and should be, and pretty much always has been, part of the creation model. It's not proof of evolution. It doesn't support evolution. In fact, it's like, thank you, Mr. Darwin, for that idea. What else you got? Because that's ours now. It fits in with our ideas beautifully, but it has no power. It can't create anything new. It can't even create much change. And if it's going to have any action at all, it's only on the most extreme genetic changes. Most all genetic changes are invisible to natural selection. So Darwin's brainchild was a complete bust.
So I know that some of the stuff that we've talked about today is covered in the documentary Darwin, the Voyage That Shook the World. And we're going to offer that for free. But before we do that, tell us about it.
In honor of Charles Darwin's 200th birthday, and in honor of the 150th anniversary of the publishing of The Origin of Species, we decided we were going to make a documentary on the life of Charles Darwin.
Okay.
So we went all around the world chasing his footsteps. We interviewed evolutionists, we interviewed some creationists, because we realized that if you want to understand evolution, you've got to understand the man and what he was thinking, the times he lived in. And there's a lot of urban myths associated with Charles Darwin that we were able to correct. Even the evolutionists were able to correct it. You got to understand what he was thinking. And then when you apply all of what we just talked about natural selection, you realize that he completely missed it. We feature a lot of that in Darwin, the Voyage That Shook the World. It's a fantastic, little less than an hour-long documentary. We really wanted to do this right. We spent a lot of money. This is a big budget production. We had a film crew. We brought all around the world. We had a high-def camera. We interviewed all these different people. We spent a lot of money in post-production doing all these graphics. It's a fantastic presentation on the life of Charles Darwin. If you want to understand evolution, you got to understand Darwin, and that was our goal. And I love the result of all that work. This documentary is amazing.
And we'll make that link available for free in the description below. Dr. Carter, thank you so much.
You're welcome.